Hello and welcome to our Back to School webinar. We've all had to adapt to remote teaching and learning in the past few months, and this need for moving schools online has unleashed a huge amount of energy and creativity as schools have started to support their students to maintain a continuity in their education. But as we start to approach our returning to a face-to-face school in some way, how are we going to better understand what the impact of these past few months have been? I think that's what we're going to be thinking about, is how do we measure what the effect of moving online as a result of COVID-19 has had on learning and on our students. So I first want to acknowledge the amazing creativity that I hear about from teachers I speak to in schools that RGL schools who've supported their pupils to maintain this continuity of learning at this difficult time. There've been no guidelines. We're all thrown into this together, and educators have really risen to the challenge. I've heard about really innovative projects that have been going on to keep students not only learning, but to keep them engaged with their schooling, with their learning, and also to keep them connected to the school community. So I've heard about, virtual assemblies, as well as messaging boards that have been used to try get pupils to better feel like they're still within a school community. And this has taken a huge amount of energy on the part of teachers to keep pupils connected to one another and to keep them motivated, which is particularly difficult at this time. But there's been with all this energy and all this huge amount of commitment, these varying initiatives to try ensure that learning is continuing, it's going to become important that we evaluate how effective these initiatives have been in terms of the progress that children have actually made. So how much progress have they made? Where are the gaps? What have they understood? What haven't they understood? Which concepts that have been delivered remotely, or which topics that have been delivered remotely, are they still struggling with? And as we start to look towards a return and start to evaluate this learning that's taken place in the past few months, we might get some surprising results. So we already know that some of our schools have said to us that certain students are actually really taking to this new way of learning, and that they're really committed and self-motivated, and they probably will have progressed really well. But the vast majority of students will have found this change quite difficult and perhaps haven't progressed as much as they would have had they been in the classroom. So how have we been able to tell whether they have been engaged in their learning, or if distance learning just simply didn't work for some of them? So some of them became really demotivated and disengaged early on and actually haven't progressed very much at all. So without the feedback that teachers get on a day-to-day basis, by having those children in your class and being able to see just from facial expressions and their attitude how they're engaging with topics and how they whether or not they've understood things, it's very difficult to know where they are without having that sort of immediate feedback. So where do we start when we start thinking about returning to school? What should our priorities be? And some schools are saying they really want to understand that impact of lockdown, as it's called in certain parts of the world, or school closures, or remote learning, or however we refer to it. What's been the impact on their well-being? So has there been this has been a time of quite high anxiety for a lot of people? Has motivation changed as a result? Another priority is identifying the gaps in learning. So the topics that were taught, or the areas that were taught after schools stopped being within buildings, so after they went online, have these really been, have they been absorbed? Have they been understood? Can you move forward from them, or do you need to repeat them? So a lot of schools are saying they plan to assess really quickly on return, so that they can act quickly and change curriculum planning and lessons to fill those gaps, and also to ensure that the other priorities to ensure that children are able to settle back in to this new way of working. And the reason I think a lot of us, or a lot of people, are calling it the new normal is that it might not be full-time schooling, it might be a variation thereof. And in this new world, it's important to know exactly where they are so the plans can be made to ensure that they progress. And The other thing is that schools will make decisions on what's right for them and their pupils. So when they assess and which bits they wish to assess first in order to understand where the gaps are, that timing will be dependent on what is right for them, their resourcing, their pupils' state of mind, whether or not they want the first few weeks to be about really understanding where their pupils are, or whether they want to ease them in a little bit more slowly. They'll make the decisions that are right. Each school will make the decisions that are right for them. But in terms of when the time comes that you want to better understand what learning gaps have opened up as a result of the past few months, we are here to help. And we're here to help you better understand what those gaps are and how you can make plans to fill them. And at that point, I'm going to hand over to Jessica, who's going to go into a bit more detail about how GL education assessments can help you in better understanding those gaps.
Thank you, Hilary. So good morning, everyone, or good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. So I'm Jessica. I'm one of the consultants in the international team at GL, usually working with schools across South Asia and the Americas. And I also work on a lot of the training materials that you may have been involved in over previous years. So as Hilary said, today what I'm going to be talking to you about is how you can use the Progress Test Series assessments to determine what has been learned over the previous academic year during school closures, and how you can use them to identify gaps very quickly, which hopefully then should help to inform short-term planning and medium-term planning for the rest of the year. So I've been moved, sorry, I apologise, I'm moving back in the wrong direction. Okay, right. So a quick overview of the Progress Test Series for anyone that is unfamiliar with them. So sometimes we refer to them as the PT series, and we have the PT series in the 3 core subjects, so English, mathematics, and in science. Once testing is complete, there are a number of different reports available. There are group reports, which you can use to look for trends in the data. And then you've also got individual reports for both teachers and parents. And I will be taking you through and giving you some examples of what you can find in those reports over the next few slides, and talking about how you can use them to look for gaps in learning. So before I continue, to reiterate on the point that Hilary was making, what is going to be pertinent for schools as they return is, and how they return, is going to be able to gain information very quickly about what has actually been learned, and possibly whether there are trends in the gaps in learning, or whether there are specific children that have bigger gaps in their knowledge than others, to determine intervention work and strategy when you go back into school. There wasn't any research out there to inform schools about best practices with remote teaching. We are in, going to use that word that keeps getting bounded around, unprecedented times. And so schools have been doing lots of different things. And as Hilary mentioned, a lot of those have been very, very creative. Some schools that I've been talking to opted for live stream lessons, whereas others have invested in new edutech resources to support lesson content. But what teachers and school leaders are really going to want to know is what has worked, and what has actually been learned by the students. And this is going to be particularly important if we think about schools going back maybe in August, September, October time, potentially on a phased approach. So if you've still got students that are learning online, you can use some information to actually say what is working, and actually what's not working, we need to adapt and change. So the Progress Test Series, it is a digital assessment. The questions are automatically marked. and the reports can be downloaded as soon as testing is finished. And this is going to be really critical for schools because they are going to need data about students as soon as possible. And what you get with the progress test series, or what you don't get, is any waiting around. There is no turnaround time. You can download the report straight away. And another benefit is your teachers are not burdened with additional marking or creating new tests at the start of the next academic year. The tests are designed to be used on a yearly basis, and if you use them more than once, you not only get a measure of attainment, but you also can see the progress that has been made from the previous assessment. That's going to be quite useful for those of you that have used the progress test series last year. Then you can see what progress has been made and whether that's or above or below expected progress over this time. So as I said, I'll take you through a couple of examples from the reports, which provide information about topics that have been understood well, gaps in learning, possible areas for development, and I will also show you the demographic analysis too, whereby you can look for trends in the data by gender, by additional need, and by students whereby English is not their first language. Okay, so the first report, or the first graph that you'll see in the group report, is this one here. What I should add here is that there isn't a limit on the number of reports that you can generate. I've had schools in the past contact me and worrying that they've maybe downloaded too many reports, or worried that they're going to be charged extra. You can download as many reports as is useful for you. So I would recommend generating the group report on both a year group level, so heads of year or heads of phase, heads of department can look for trends across a particular cohort. And also you probably want to download it class by class as well, so the teachers can use it to inform their lesson planning. This particular graph provides a top level view of the attainment scores across one particular group. The pink line there is the standardization. So generally, in a typical school, we would expect the green bars to fall in line with that pink line. Now, of course, every school is different, every cohort is different. So you might find that your data is skewed more one way or the other. And it may be that your data is skewed to the left or to the right, and that's going to give you a nice picture of the attainment of the group as a whole. And if you've used the progress test series before, I would recommend comparing this graph with the previous year to see whether there has been any change in that overall trend. So I've put a couple of pointers there on the side. You can compare the trend against the standardization. You can see whether the data is skewed towards the left, whereby you've got more scores towards the average and below average range, or have you got more scores in the upper end there, so high attainers. And if you compare against classes or compare against year groups, it might tell you some information about whether there's particular cohorts that need particular attention moving forward. As we go further into the report, we can see next level of analysis, and this one here is by curriculum content. This particular example is from the PD series in science. What we are looking at is the percentage of correct answers by biology, by chemistry, and by physics. So again, that pink bar there is the UK standardization. So you can compare the green bar, so that would be your student scores against that. But what this allows you to do is to start to dig a bit deeper into which areas require additional attention. So here, for example, I can see immediately that students are not answering questions in physics, or answering correctly as many questions in physics as they are both against the standardization, because there's a big gap between the larger pink bar and the smaller green one, but also against biology and chemistry. So if I were a science teacher and this was my class, I could then start to consider why this might be the case and start to ask some questions. So that I didn't cover as much of the physics curriculum, and I favoured teaching biology and chemistry either over the whole academic year or particularly during the school closures time. It might be that I only taught elements of physics towards the start of the year, and it's been forgotten about over time. And what it tells me is I probably need to go back and revisit some physics content and have a bit more of an even balance in the next year. If I were head of science, and this was a particular year group, or I was comparing different classes, I could compare this from other year groups and see if there's general trends. So am I seeing across the year groups physics is always slightly lower than the other sciences? So does that mean that my teachers might require particular development in certain parts of physics curriculum? Or if we're talking specifically about school closures, then it might be that perhaps the methods that we use to teach this particular area weren't as effective as they were for biology and chemistry, for example. So these are just some of the considerations, some of the questions you might start asking when you're starting to look at this data. I have another example here, just to give you a different subject area. So we have the PT series analysis in PT English. So what we have is comparison of English skills. So we've got spelling, grammar and punctuation, and then against reading comprehension of both narrative and non-narrative texts. So as I said previously, I would recommend, if you can, generate it by a whole year group, look at bigger trends in the data, and also if you want your class teachers to download this by class, and they can start digging deeper and reflecting on what has worked and what might need readdressing and revisiting as we go back into school. The next level of analysis is the question level analysis. This one here is taken from a progress test in maths. So the question code runs along the bottom of the graph, and that corresponds with a particular question which you will get underneath in that report. Pink line again, that is your standardization, and the green bar shows the percentage correct for each question. So what you can see here is that you can very quickly spot where there are very specific gaps in knowledge and in learning. So there are, on this particular graph, there are gaps there, and I can look at those gaps, find the corresponding question that matches the code, and find out where my students were struggling. So again, what are the reasons behind these gaps? Did we not teach that content over the year? If not, why not? How are we going to plan to fit it into this year if we need to? If we did cover it, why was it not learned by the students? And how can we revisit it successfully and effectively now moving forward? So this is going to be a very specific way of identifying very particular gaps in knowledge with the question level analysis. So what you also get within the group reports are further analyses, which I think are going to be really useful, particularly following this period of school closures, because you can start to look at the impact that the school closures have had, not only on a whole group or class by class, but also at specific groups. So, for example, has it had a greater impact on students with additional needs? Has it had a bigger impact on students who don't speak English at home and therefore over the last few months haven't had as much exposure to English, and what impact has this had on their attainment there? There is also further analysis if you wanted to compare boys versus girls, for example, and depending on how you upload your student information. So if you upload, when you upload your student data, you can choose whether there's other different groups that are specific to your school that you want to analyse further. But I do think this area is going to be an interesting and also critical one to look at following the closures this year. So in addition to the graphical analysis that you get within the report, you will also get a standardized score for every student within the group report. So this is going to help you identify very, very quickly which students are not attaining at the expected level for their age. You can generate this report so that students come up alphabetically. You want to compare them with a register, for example, or as this one has been generated here, you can generate them by overall overall standardized score. So this one is in descending order. You can look towards the bottom if that's an area that you want to look at and think is critical. Those students that are attaining below the average for their age, and then you can start looking at their individual report if you want to dig a bit deeper into why are they not attaining at such a higher level. And then I've got some examples of the individual report. So in the table at the top, you can see included the number of questions attempted, the standardized scores in the middle there, and then with the older year groups, you will also get an indicator for GCSE. So you can see there's a C/4. So depending on whether you go by letters or numbers, you can access both there. The individual reports also provide further analysis, so you can identify where the gaps in knowledge and development areas are. So similar to the group report, you also get this on an individual level as well. So if you look at the first or the second table here, the analysis of curriculum content categories, you can see that in number, this student only achieved 37% correct versus 78% in statistics. And if you look further down, they actually didn't answer either of the two probability questions correctly. And just like I discussed with the group report, you know, a teacher can then use their knowledge of what and how they taught during the academic year and during school closures to think about the reasons behind some of those low scores. You might find there's trends, so there might be a group of students with particular gaps that might require specific intervention, as well as individual students as well. So as Hilary mentioned, you know, different students will have responded to the school closures differently. You also get question level analysis within the individual report. So again, just like the group reports, you've got that top level view as well as digging down deeper. I think this could be useful for determining differentiated classwork or homework, and really seeing, you know, what were the stumbling blocks, what was it that they didn't get right this time around, and is it expected or not expected. And then finally, what I will add in here, so on our website we have links to the national curricula. So progress test series are mapped to the English national curricula. We have a number of international schools following a number of different curriculum types that do use the progress test series successfully. But these are useful to look at because what they do is they detail the national curriculum that is expected to be covered for each year before taking the progress test series. And they are available for each subject, so for English, mathematics and for science. And they are included for each level of the progress test series. I will add, these are not designed to be used as a scheme of work. They're not a tick list. They shouldn't be used to teach to the test, but they may be useful in supporting the short and medium term planning as you start opening up and going back into school and analysing what has been learned during this time. Before I move on to let Andy ask us all the questions, first of all, the Education Endowment Foundation wrote and released a report in April this year called Best Evidence in Supporting Students Learning Remotely. Some useful tips in there and guidance about online and remote learning. But what I thought was there was a couple of things that I picked out from there which I thought really stood out. So one is that when thinking about how we're teaching remotely, They've said what matters most is whether the explanation builds clearly on pupils' prior knowledge or how pupils' understanding is subsequently assessed. So emphasis on assessment and determining, what is working and what isn't. What they've also said is using technology to support retrieval and self-quizzing can help pupils retain key ideas and knowledge, but it is not a replacement for other forms of assessments. So they're quite clear that schools should continue with usual assessment practices as they can. And then what's also interesting at the end, they do caveat it that the evidence that they pulled together for the report are from contexts that are not, exactly the same as this current situation, because it hasn't happened before. But they do say, in all cases, it's important for teachers and school leaders to use their professional judgment in determining the support they provide pupils and to monitor its impact on learning. And I think that's really, really key. We've been through this period now of a different style of working with our students, with our children, and we need to now see kind of what is working, what has been learned, and use that information to then move forward. And on that note, before I do stop, I just want to add that we are planning to carry out some research in the autumn term, so September, October time, to look at trends from results of the PT series from across the globe, so UK and international schools. And there is a plan to put together a report to look for trends, to look at the impact of school closures on learning. So just keep an eye out for that in the latter part of the year, because I'm sure you'll find that really useful and interesting to look into. I will hand back to Andy and take any of your questions.